Fire moves faster than people expect. In a heavy timber forest, a crown fire leaps from treetop to treetop without ever touching the ground. It travels at speeds that outrun a galloping horse. It doesn't just burn wood, it consumes oxygen, turning the very air into a vacuum of heat that sears the lungs before the flames even arrive. In finance, we have a different word for this. We call it a liquidity crisis. It starts with a spark, a single default, a whispered rumor about a bank's balance sheet. Within hours, the timber of the global market, the stocks, the digital promises, becomes fuel. One moment, you are looking at a screen filled with green numbers. The next, the screen is black, the exits are barred, and the air is filled with the smoke of vaporized fortunes. Most people spend their lives trying to outrun the fire. They think speed is safety. They think they can sell before the heat hits. They're wrong. In a true firestorm, the only survival is shelter. And shelter requires something that fire cannot penetrate: stone. Silas Vance learned the physics of ruin at the age of 10. It was October 1987. His father, Thomas Vance, was a timber king of the old stock exchange, a man who had built a massive empire on the back of high-growth manufacturing stocks. Thomas believed in the permanent plateau of prosperity. On Black Monday, the fire arrived. Silas watched as 40 years of his father's wealth was incinerated in 6.5 hours. By sunset, the Vance name was ash. His father didn't survive the winter, not because he was hungry, but because a man who defines himself by the height of his timber cannot breathe when the forest is gone. Silas was left with a modest inheritance and a scarring realization. Water does not burn. Mud does not burn. And stone. Stone does not produce toxic gases when the world is on fire. While the other orphans of that crash tried to rebuild their father's paper empires, Silas did something strange. He stopped looking at the treetops. He started looking at the earth. By 2018, the global economy was a lush, overgrown forest of cheap money. Interest rates were at rock bottom. Digital assets were soaring. Silas Vance, now 35, founded a firm called Petra Holdings. But Petra didn't trade. It didn't disrupt. Silas spent his days buying rocks. He bought deep-water rights in the Midwest. He bought decommissioned salt mines in Kansas. He bought thousands of tons of physical copper, lead, and silver, not as futures contracts, but as physical cathodes stored in private non-bank vaults he built himself. For 6 years, Silas lined his cave. Every dollar his firm made was diverted into thermal mass, assets that were boring, heavy, and entirely illiquid. The industry laughed. Cyrus Blackwood, the king of the cloud asset hedge funds, was the loudest. Blackwood dealt in high-frequency leverage and synthetic positions. He was the tallest tree in the forest. Silas is building a tomb for his career, Blackwood announced at a 2022 gala. He's burying capital in the ground like a squirrel. The 1987 fire must have cooked whatever brains he had left. The laughter echoed through the elite circles. Silas was a relic, an orphan who refused to grow up. The warning signs didn't start with a crash. They started with a drift. In the rigid world of traditional banking, you use mark-to-market accounting. It's the ultimate reality check. It means your assets are worth exactly what someone is willing to pay for them at 4 p.m. today. But as the market grew more complex, the elite moved toward mark-to-model. In the industry, this is often called mark-to-magic. It allowed firms to ignore falling prices in the real world and instead rely on mathematical formulas that projected high returns in a future that didn't yet exist. By 2024, Cyrus Blackwood's timber was valued at billions based on these models. But Silas Vance looked at the rising interest rates and the drying credit creeks and knew the air was getting thin. He spent that autumn stockpiling. He checked the stone lining of his vaults. He prepared for 100 people because he knew that when the fire came, The very people who laughed at him would be the first to run toward his door. The lightning strike happened on August 15th. It was a systemic clearing failure. A major digital ledger, the paper road that connected the world's banks, suffered a catastrophic breach. Within minutes, the escape routes closed. You couldn't sell stocks because the clearinghouse was dark. You couldn't withdraw cash because the ATMs were part of the grid. The timber of the global economy was suddenly cut off from its roots. Panic wasn't a word for it. It was an inferno. Cyrus Blackwood sat in his penthouse, watching his $10 billion portfolio show a value of N/A. He had billions, but he couldn't buy a gallon of water. Silas Vance walked to the center of the financial district, climbed onto a concrete barrier, and shouted over the chaos of men in $5,000 suits crying in the street. "The vault! Follow me to the stone! It will hold everyone!" The crowd hesitated. They remembered the jokes. But as the heat of the collapse began to singe their lungs, even pride could not survive. 103 people, the very elite who had mocked Silas, followed him into the dark opening of his private vault. Cyrus Blackwood was the last to enter. They spent 6 days underground. Outside, the firestorm raged. 3 major banks collapsed. The global supply chain snapped. On the surface, people were realizing that you cannot eat a synthetic derivative. Inside Silas's vault, the air stayed cool. The stone lining, the physical commodities and the hard infrastructure Silas had built, acted as a thermal mass. The interior was a steady 55 degrees. They had water from private wells and food from physical reserves. For 144 hours, the 100 most powerful people in the world sat in a stone room, staring at the man they had called simple. Silas didn't gloat. He simply monitored the ventilation channels that brought in fresh air from a source the digital fire couldn't reach. He had spent 6 years building a womb. They had spent 6 years building a tomb. On the morning of the 7th day, the smoke cleared. Silas opened the door. The world they walked out into was transformed. The forest of 2024 was gone. The skyscrapers were still there, but the wealth they represented was rubble. Cyrus Blackwood emerged into the sunlight, his suit ruined, his pride broken. He looked at Silas, then looked away. What could he say? He had called Silas simple because Silas understood the only arithmetic that matters, the arithmetic of survival. 6 years to build. 6 days of shelter. Silas Vance didn't become the new king of Wall Street. He moved to a small cabin near his vault, continuing to maintain the stone for the next fire. At the entrance to his firm today, carved into the stone, are 2 numbers, 6 and 6. It's the ratio of patience to panic. Some things in this world cannot be leveraged. They can only be built stone by stone until the day the air begins to burn. And on that day, only the stone remains. If this story gave you a new lens through which to view the coming fire, show us. Hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications.